this really represents the start of a collaborative program we are developing from the UK, but with Dr. Adebayo and his EMMSAR organization. So I wanted to introduce the whole topic, and we will have time for discussion afterwards. I wanted to introduce the whole topic of the importance of calfitability. I'm hoping that will work. Okay, and I want to present this in relation, in the context of reproductive efficiency. And reproductive efficiency is critical to the whole of production efficiency or productivity of the whole issue of animal production. And we need to produce healthy calves, newborn healthy calves, as frequently as possible. What are the reasons for this? Why am I saying that? And we need to do it for the first of all, for the continuity of milking, and in order to achieve the maximum long-term yield of milk from an individual cow. Secondly, obviously, to ensure the future production of the next generation. And obviously that applies to both milk and beef. And then if we are embarked on a program of genetic improvement, in order to gain that genetic improvement of the stock, we obviously need to make reproduction as efficient as possible. Just want to say a little bit about lactation, and at the top right hand corner of this slide it shows a schematic diagram really of a lactation curve of a dairy cow. And don't worry too much about the time scales or the yield at the moment, but what I wanted to show was that yield effectively starts obviously immediately after parturition. There's a rapid buildup of milk synthesis during the last days of pregnancy, and then after parturition, milk yield rises rapidly to a peak over a matter of weeks. And then there is a gradual reduction, a gradual tail off over a period. And this would probably, if you let it, continue for a very long time. But obviously in agriculture, in livestock production, one wants to manage the shape of that lactation curve and the so-called persistency, how long that lasts for. Now, in countries where intensive milk production is practiced, for general purposes, the target rate of calf production is 1 per year. So dairy farmers tend to aim to produce 1 calf per cow every year. Now that is a generalization. It is not always the case, and particularly where you have in our country cows that are very, very high producers, it tends to be longer than 1 year, the optimum target rate of calf production. And obviously where there are stresses or where there may be shortages of feed or something like that, then this may be difficult to achieve or not desirable. But by and large, that is a good target to be thinking about, 1 calf per year. Now, under those circumstances, a cow would normally be milked for around 10 months. So if we look back at my little graph at the top there, that period, the lactation period, would be about 10 months. And then the procedure is to dry that cow off for a period of around 2 months in order for the mammary gland to regenerate before the next calving or parturition. And that is the normal way in which the lactation cycle is managed. Now, those timings may vary depending on the constraints of the production system, but nevertheless, you want to create a situation where calf production, the rate of calf production is optimal, where the milk yield and the length of time that milk is being produced is optimal, but also to give the cow sufficient time for her mammary gland, for the udder to regenerate from that lactation in preparation for the next. So moving on, I want to say a little bit more about that calving interval. And the calving interval is the period between when the cow produces a calf and then when she produces the next one. And as I've just said, what we might be aiming for is something around 1 year or 365 days. Now, the gestation period, the pregnancy period, is variable, we know, in cows depending on breed and other circumstances. But if we take it at around 280 days, around I always say around 9.5 months, in order to achieve that 365-day calving interval, after parturition, it is necessary for that cow to become pregnant again by about 85 days after calving. And thus that postpartum period, or that so-called calving to conception interval, is very important to prepare the cow for the next pregnancy. And of course, that's taking place during this period of peak lactation. Now, in being able to manage both the lactation and the reproduction of the cow, obviously good management is critical. And nutrition tends to play a major, if not the major role in this, because the cow's both lactation and reproductive system are critically dependent on good nutrition. But also we need some other things. And I've put these last two things probably in slightly the wrong order, but I would say, first of all, we need to have close observation and monitoring of the cow for its health in particular and for its behavior. And then secondly, it's good to have an understanding of the biology, the reproductive biology that is going on inside the cow. And I've spent a large portion of my professional life studying exactly that. Now, in the box to the right, I've put cost of 1 day extension of calving interval, 500 to 750 naira. Now, I would like any one of you to challenge me on that, because when I produced these slides a few days ago, I was thinking, what is the cost of an extension in calving interval likely to be in Nigeria? And quite frankly, I have no idea. But I thought of what it costs here. I made some extrapolations. I did the currency conversion, etc. and came up with that. Now, if you like, that number is a starting point, and I would welcome a discussion on what, first of all, what the target calving interval might be. And I'm sure it would be variable across the country depending on the systems. But equally, if that interval is extended beyond whatever that target is, what is the cost of that? Because there is an economic cost. Okay, and we can come back to these things later. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the calving interval. And this is just a very simplistic kind of review, really, of the stages that one goes through. So in this postpartum period, one is dealing with the potential rebreeding of the animal. And then at some stage, the cow will become pregnant. And there is a need to monitor that pregnancy through pregnancy diagnosis. And we'll say a little bit more about that later. And then taking us to the last stage, the next calving. Now, I want to talk about those components in a bit more detail. And this slide's a little bit complicated, and I'm not going to explain it all right now, but I just wanted to explain part of it. So along the bottom here, we have the calving interval. And this slide was prepared with the UK in mind some years ago. So we have a target there of 365 days. And if you go up to the top here, you have this period after calving until the cow conceives again, the calving to conception interval, and then the gestation period or pregnancy, as I said, around 280 or so days. But an important thing to remember, and I've said that it's important to try to get the cow pregnant again as soon as is practically possible after calving. But the problem, one of the problems is that the cow doesn't start to have estrous cycles again in the immediate period after calving. And it may take several weeks, or in some circumstances, even longer than that, before she starts to cycle again. I'm sorry, my cursor is flying around all over the place. It's not very easy to control. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in relation to progesterone levels a little bit later. I'm going to come back to talk about that. But the other point I want to make while I'm on this slide, and I'm sorry about this cursor, but is we know that cows don't conceive to every service, to every insemination. And it may be she does, we hope she does, but very often she won't. And it may take two, it may take three, it may take four services. The problem being that every time that she doesn't become pregnant at an insemination or service, you effectively lose 21 days. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So let's move on to the anatomy a little bit of the cow's reproductive tract. And this will be pretty familiar to you as veterinarians and so on. I apologize, it's not very well focused, not a very good quality picture. But if you imagine we've effectively cut the cow longitudinally effectively down the middle, and are looking at it from the right hand side. And we see up there, obviously the tail and the vertebrae. I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening to this cursor. the vertebrae. Below that in red is the rectum, and below that is the reproductive tract, opening to the outside through the vulva. We have the vagina here, the cervix, which is normally tightly closed to protect the environment of the inner reproductive tract, the uterus, the uterine horns, and then we have the ovaries here attached to the uterine horns. And I'm going to show one or two more slides to explain that a little bit more. So here we have a reproductive tract that has been removed from a dead cow, obviously, and showing the left and the right uterine horns. Now, those of you who are experienced at looking at that would immediately jump to the conclusion that that cow has probably had, I don't know how many actually, but maybe 3 or 4 calves before, because if this was a heifer that hadn't born a calf, the uterine horns would be much closer together, and the diameter would be much less. And if you can see, there are some folds on the horns here, and that is quite diagnostic of a cow which has born calves, because what it reflects is the stretching and involution after calving, and it never goes back to quite its original size and appearance. Lower, the 2 horns come together into the uterine body, and this will be familiar to many of you. And then on each side, connected to the ends of the uterine horns, are the ovaries. There's the left one, there's the right one. This one has been incised, it's been cut, and the material there, the deep colored material, the yellow-orange color, is you will recognize as a corpus luteum, I think. So this is another one, just to show it more diagrammatically. Imagine looking at it from above, and here we have the vulva going to the outside, the vagina, the cervix or neck of the womb, as it's otherwise known, body of the uterus, left horn, right horn, and the ovaries, the fallopian tubes linking the ends of the uterine horns to the ovaries. And the other thing you'll see on this one are these structures here, which are on the internal surface, the mucosa of the endometrium, which are the caruncles, which you'll know are where the placenta attaches to the embryo and fetus. And the presence of these structures are distinctive for a ruminant animal, as I think you'll remember from your anatomy. So this one looks to me as if it's from a younger animal than the previous one, because it looks smaller and much more compact. And I always think of the heifer's reproductive tract as like looking down on 2 of your knuckles, actually, on your hand. If you imagine just your first and second fingers, it's kind of that sort of shape and appearance. Here's another one. I don't think I think I've explained enough. I probably don't need to reiterate that anymore. But I wanted to show you this in slightly more detail, because we have 2 ovaries here from a cow's reproductive tract, and the right one in particular seems more active at this point in time. And what we have on the right-hand side here is a fairly mature or maturing ovarian follicle, Graafian follicle, which, as you will know, contains the ovum or the egg. And the process of ovulation at estrus, the follicle ruptures and releases that ovum into the fallopian tube, and it passes down into the uterus, as you know. Once that ovulation has taken place, then the space that it leaves is invaded by other cells and develops into the so-called corpus luteum. So this is a fairly mature corpus luteum in the other part of the ovary. And again, I'm not sure from this where it's actually been incised. So we're looking at two halves, or whether it's two separate corpora lutea. To have two is not usual, actually. It's usually just a single one. Corpus luteum, for those of you who don't know, is just Latin, which means yellow body. And what you will also be aware of, I think, that it's the corpus luteum which is responsible for production of the steroid hormone, progesterone, commonly thought of as the hormone of pregnancy, and it's cells in the follicle which produce estrogen, and estrogen being effectively responsible for the maturation of the follicle, but also the behavioral signs of estrus. The ovary on the left here looks relatively less active, but you can see signs of small follicles there. That's one there in particular. I don't know whether you can see that. It's about 2/3 the way up and slightly to the right-hand side. And then there are a number further down, more towards the left side. But there are many, many follicles present on ovaries from birth, but they are very, very small, mostly. Okay, so moving on, I wanted to talk about artificial insemination a little bit. And I know there's going to be another session talking specifically about this, but I just wanted to mention it in passing. The advantages of artificial insemination is that it gives the dairy producer or the cattle producer access to higher genetic quality. And in some cases, though, in terms of the bulls, in terms of the sires, and in some cases, those bulls might have proven progeny tests, so that you know very much, very in great detail, what the genetic characteristics of that bull are. But there are other advantages in that it reduces or potentially eliminates the need to keep a bull. Thinking about both the potential danger in case of some breeds of bull and the expense, the added expense. And of course, it reduces the chances of venereal diseases, spread of venereal diseases, particularly things like Campylobacter fetus, formerly known as Vibrio, possibly Brucella, but also things like Neospora, Trichomonas, etc. But of course, like every technology, it brings some disadvantages too. And the disadvantages are you have to manage the cows very carefully, observe the cows very carefully, and ensure there is accurate estrus detection, because the timing of AI is absolutely critical, as you will know, and you need to get that right. There's also a potential cost if repeated inseminations are needed. So if that first insemination for any reason is unsuccessful, then it has to be repeated, and that may in addition to the delay that I talked about, the 21-day delay, there is also an added cost perhaps of a repeated insemination. And of course, it needs a high level of skill, usually carried out by a trained technician or a veterinarian. Very briefly, the technique, as you'll be aware, is that one arm is inserted into the rectum and the reproductive tract below it is located with that hand and held with that hand. And in that way, the catheter, which one is shown at the bottom, containing the semen, is inserted through the vulva and into the cervix. And it is quite an acquired technique to be able to do that with precision. And you'll know that the cervix, if the cow, or particularly in a young animal, is not in heat, is not in estrus, then the cervix tends to be quite tightly closed. But it does open somewhat during estrus. So I want to say a little bit about estrus or heat and its detection. As we've said, the normal cycle is 21 days. The detection of heat is obviously critical, and its detection is critical for good reproductive performance. I just wanted to check, actually, could somebody just confirm that they are hearing me, please?
Yes, we are.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Okay. I just didn't want to be sitting here talking to myself for the morning. So signs. There are a number of signs which may vary in intensity and duration. First of all, increased physical activity is often a sign. Possible drop in milk yield. Mounting other cows, but also potentially standing to be mounted themselves. Bellowing or increased frequency and volume of mooing, and also mucus vaginal discharge. But I think you'll be familiar with these to a large degree. But the problem is that if one heat is missed, then you have to wait 21 days for the next opportunity, as I've mentioned. And it's interesting, actually, that this good heat detection is still, so artificial insemination has been used, I would say, almost routinely for 60 or 70 years in the UK. And still, heat detection is the major constraint in achieving optimum fertility. Despite all that time, all that experience, all the advice, all the extension work that has gone into this, it still remains a very difficult problem to get optimum efficiency on the farm. So just to reiterate some of the signs, the cow is possibly restless, showing increased physical activity. She's mooing a lot or bellowing a lot. She might give less milk, allows herself to be mounted, or alternatively mounts others. And then you may see a swollen vulva with a clear discharge. Obviously, if the discharge isn't clear, if it looks as if there's a significant amount of blood or pus or anything, clearly that suggests some pathology going on, some abnormality. I just put that up again just to remind us about the follicle producing estrogen, but also the ovum, and the corpus luteum producing progesterone. And I'm going to come back now to talk a little bit about the hormones and also how they relate to the estrus cycle. And if we take the period here where it says on the left, where it says ovulation inside the green star, the gray period just before that is really the period when one would anticipate and observe the cow in heat, and that would be normally be taken as day 0 here. But what is actually happening inside the cow during that time? And what is happening is that there are high progesterone levels due to the presence of a corpus luteum on the ovary. And over the few days before the estrus, those progesterone levels start to fall, process known as luteolysis. Estrogen levels are generally low throughout the cycle, but they start to rise during this period. And I'm going to show you a little bit more detail about that in a moment. So estrogen levels rise, and as I said before, it's estrogen that is responsible for the behavioral signs of estrus. And then ovulation, the actual release of the egg, tends to occur right at the end of estrus, or often on the day after that estrus behavior has happened. And then following on from that, if you remember, I mentioned after ovulation, the follicle bursts, it ruptures, releases the egg, and then progesterone, the corpus luteum forms, progesterone levels rise, and then progesterone is dominant for most of the cycle. If the cow is not pregnant, then towards at around day 16 or 17 or so, those progesterone levels start to fall again. And that's due to the internal release of another hormone, prostaglandin F2 alpha, which you will also be aware of, I'm sure. And the cycle repeats. Here's another one. And I just wanted to introduce another idea to you that it shows it in a slightly different way. But what I wanted to also mention is that the ovary is under the control of the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland at the base of the brain releases the two hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, LH and FSH. And LH in particular is the thing that is driving the final stages of that follicle maturation. And there is a peak of LH and also LH, which coincides with that day of heat. And the rest of that is pretty much as we described. I've got a little schematic diagram up here, which shows a follicle growing in the blue with the red dot. The red dot is the ovum of the egg. That grows on the surface. The follicle eventually ruptures, releasing the ovum. It would be fertilized somewhere in the reproductive tract, and then the ruptured follicle develops into this corpus luteum, which then produces the progesterone. So I'm going to move on now to talk in more detail, and I've nearly finished actually, not too much more, about progesterone. And this slide is work from some colleagues of mine who's done many years ago, measuring progesterone in milk, because progesterone is secreted into the blood, but it's also then passes into the milk. And so you can monitor the progesterone levels in milk. And what this shows is that if you take samples from cows, and in this case, it was done twice or 3 times a week, then you can monitor their cycles. So I'm going back to the extreme left, and that was effectively the day of heat. And this data is a mean of several hundred cows. And you'll see progesterone rises up to a peak, and then a few days before estrus, it starts to fall. And 0 there being the day of heat. These cows were inseminated, So they were inseminated, they ovulated, a new corpus luteum forms, the progesterone rises and goes up to this point at around day 12 or 13. And then you see something happens. And either the progesterone continues to stay high and even rises some more, or it starts to fall again. And it's at this point that determines whether that cow is actually pregnant or not. So if it stays high, the most likely reason for that is that the cow is pregnant, and those levels will stay high for the whole duration of the pregnancy. But if the cow is not pregnant, then they will fall again and she will come back into heat there. Okay, so I'm going back to that slide I showed before about components of the calving interval. And the wiggly line across the middle there represents progesterone concentrations, either in blood or in milk, and what's happening in the cow after calving. So after calving, there's a period of low progesterone because the ovary is inactive for a period. But then progesterone levels start to rise as the ovary becomes more active. And very often you get this little transient rise that only lasts for a few days before things start properly. So that area there, shown as day 22, would constitute the first proper ovulation, if I can put it that way. And then we get these cycles lasting around 21 days. And then in this cow, this imaginary cow, she's inseminated. She's served at day 64. And remember what I said about day 85 being the critical one here. She's served at day 64, but for some reason, sorry, I keep losing my pointer. For some reason, she doesn't stay pregnant or doesn't get pregnant to that service. So she returns to heat 21 days later. She's then served again. She's then inseminated again. Progesterone levels rise. This time, she's pregnant, and she maintains those high levels of progesterone until 280 or so days later, when she gives birth, i.e. parturition. So if you can track progesterone levels in that way, it's very useful to determine where a cow is in her cycle, in her overall reproductive cycle. The problem being that progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum and can be produced both by the non-pregnant cow and the pregnant cow. So unless you're absolutely sure of your timing, you cannot really use progesterone itself as an accurate diagnostic test for pregnancy. I'll come back to some of that in a moment, but I wanted to just show, and my PhD student, Bridget, I wanted to just acknowledge her here. These pictures were taken from some farms in Kenya where she was working on her PhD project. And I wanted to show this because it brought home to me some of the practical barriers to estrus detection. And I mentioned that one of the diagnostic changes is increased physical activity. Well, of course, if a cow is restrained, it's hard to observe increased physical activity. The other thing, in some of these sheds, the ceiling or the roof is very low. So a cow would be unable to mount another cow under those circumstances. So what I'm saying is the movement can be restricted in some of these situations. And so these are some of the barriers to being able to detect estrus in the practical situation. So, as I mentioned, this has been a big problem in dairy production throughout the world for many years. And so various clever people have decided to, or tried to, develop systems of improving this. And there are a number of aids that can be used to help estrus detection. And one of them is so-called heat mount detectors. Show you an example in a minute. Activity meters, where you can monitor the physical activity of the animal, and then also progesterone test. And I'm going to say a bit more about that as well. Or the alternative is, and I'm not going to talk about this today at all, we can actually control that hormonal cycle, that reproductive cycle, artificially by use of injecting hormones, and in particular prostaglandin. There are other methods too, which I'm not going to say anymore. We could perhaps talk about this in a future seminar if you're interested. A heat mount detector. This is a particular one called Estratect or Estratect. And again, thank you to Bridget Muasa for the slide from her thesis. And what it is effectively a strip or a patch that you put on the back of the cow. And when she's mounted, you get it's almost like a scratch card, if you're familiar with a scratch card for gambling purposes, actually. There is a covering of foil, which is effectively rubbed off by the mounting and exposes a different color. And there are various different versions of heat mount detectors. That's just one of them. And then another one, which is really using very modern technology, digital technology, an electronic pedometer. And this is a device that is strapped to the leg of the cow. There are also versions that can be strapped to the neck, but this is one that's on the leg. And they are basically dependent on a device known as an accelerometer. And this detects movement. And this can be stored electronically in the device, and it can be downloaded by Wi-Fi means to a computer that monitors the movement of the animal. This, again, is part of Bridget's work. And in this case, because she was working on private small farms, we weren't able to use the Wi-Fi. So she actually had to download the data from the activity meters in a manual way by using a device there brought close to the activity meter, and then with downloaded onto a laptop which she's got there. So those are just some of the methods that can be used, but I also wanted to talk about progesterone. Now, progesterone really has remained the most useful test really in bovine reproduction. But as I've mentioned, it does have its limitations. And one of the limitations for many years was that it had to be done in a lab. So you had to take the sample, either a blood sample, and then either collect the serum or plasma, and then do a fairly complex test on it in the lab. But as I mentioned, progesterone is also present in milk, so it can be done on milk. But the technology really what has become what we would say is a game changer is when a test became available based on the lateral flow technology, where in effect you could have just a small strip that you place into the sample, and that you get a change on that, a visible change on that strip that tells you whether the progesterone is high or low. And we've been working with a product called P4, P4 basically is the scientific abbreviation for progesterone, P4 rapid, which you can use at the side of the cow, inside the cow shed. You can take a milk sample and you can put a spot of milk onto this and get a result within 10 minutes and know whether the progesterone is high or low. And that can be used for a number of purposes. And just going back to my diagram here, that if we test an animal at 21 days after service, and I've lost my cursor again, I'm sorry, there it is. If we test an animal at 21 days after service, and I'm looking at 21 days near the far right-hand corner of this. So if you move up from there, then you will see that the progesterone might be high or it might be low. If it's high at that point, it tells you that cow is most likely pregnant. If it's low, it will tell you it's definitely not. The problem is that that high level there is not absolutely specific, because there are other conditions that can cause that high progesterone. The advantage of using progesterone then is it's a very early test. Whereas if you are going to palpate, rectal palpation, it will be several weeks before you can do that, even in the case of ultrasound scanning, depending on the skill and the sensitivity of the equipment, it can still be a matter of 6 weeks or so. So progesterone has some advantages about the early stage at which you can use it, but you have to be very careful in the interpretation. Conception rates. Adebayo, I'm thinking I'm running out of time, actually. Do you think I should stop there?
Yeah, probably may just do this slide and then we can wrap up from here.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to talk about conception rates. And the word conception is used very loosely, and it can mean different things. We have to be very careful how we use it, really. And what I've talked about is if you inseminate a cow and she returns at 21 days, the assumption is that conception has failed. But in fact, it's been shown experimentally that most cows do conceive when they're inseminated at the right time. But many, many more actually return. And that return rate might be 50% or more. And what that means is that a lot of cows lose their embryos in those first few days of pregnancy, but they will then return to estrus after 21 days. And the assumption is that she was never pregnant, but in fact, she may have been pregnant and lost the embryo. And that is known to occur in quite a high proportion of cases. So we need to be very clear about what we mean by conception and conception rates. And I always like to use the term successful conception rate, and then that implies that the eventual pregnancy will go on to be successful. That is the end, actually. So now there are 2 more seminars in this series that I'm aware of. I think next week is more on focusing on artificial insemination. And then in 2 weeks' time, my former PhD student, Bridget Moassa, is going to talk in more detail about the progesterone test and progesterone testing. And the ultimate aim of our project is to build more awareness of the whole importance of cow fertility in terms of maximizing overall productivity, and introducing the progesterone test as an aid, as a tool in that overall focus on reproductive management. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. You've done a great job, and this has been very interesting and educating. And I know we have some people that may have questions, and so please, if you have a question or you have questions you want to ask, you can indicate by raising your hand, and you will be given an opportunity to ask questions. Mike, can they unmute themselves and ask questions? Hello, Mike.
Hi.
Yeah, can they unmute and ask questions, or they will have to raise their hand first?
If you ask people with raised hands to ask the questions, so that
Oh, okay,
get several people at once.
Yeah, that's
so
fine.
the first one, yeah. So the first one I see there is it Elijah?
Yes, Elijah additional.
Do you want to go ahead?
Compliment of the day, everybody, and thank you very much, Andy, for this wonderful presentation. It took me back to my reproductive anatomy and physiology class, and I was following with keen interest. Kudos to you and the organizers. So I actually have two questions. You talked about the estrus cycle. I want to know what is the duration of estrus actually when the animal come on heat, because it is in this window that I actually do the mating or carry out artificial insemination. So how many days is the animal going to remain in estrus for this to carry out? That's the first question. Then the second one, on calving interval, you recommended postpartum mating of 85 days and a calving interval of not more than 365 days. So the question is, with this, how many calves should a cow give before it is being called off? Then my colleague here is asking about, sitting right beside me, about the lifespan of the spermatozoa when it is inseminated.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the last, because you said two and I think you've asked three actually. What was the last one, please?
The lifespan of spermatozoa when it is inseminated.
Sorry, say that again, please, Adebayo.
The lifespan of spermatozoa when it is inseminated in a cow.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, all very good questions. Duration. Well, let me cover the second one first, because the other two are very much related. How many? I think you're asking how many calves or how many lactations, and this is very variable. And it's a bit difficult for me because I don't know a lot about the production systems in Nigeria, but the kind of current belief, the current wisdom from the UK is that one should manage the cow in such a way as to maximize the so-called longevity of the animal, because some studies have shown, and both modeling studies have shown, that if you maximize the longevity, that maximizes the overall efficiency of the animal during its lifetime. And so, but in our country, a lot of animals are put under a huge amount of lactational stress, such that, and I'm going to ask Mike to come in here in a minute because he's an experienced practitioner, but
do you want me to jump in there?
No, sorry, wait, I haven't quite finished my sentence. That the number of lactations can be as low as something like 2.5, an average of 2.5 or 3. But that is pretty undesirable. You would want it to be significantly more than that. Mike, yeah, please come in.
there's two answers to that question. One is if a cow is healthy and producing lots of milk, she should stay in the herd as long as possible. Now, in the European situation, cows will produce more milk each lactation up until the 5th or 6th lactation, and then it starts to wane again. So therefore, you want any cow over 8, 9, 10 will be beginning to lose yield. So therefore, at that point, they should be thinking about exiting the herd. The lifetime yield, again, it's a European sort of figure from Germany, is that you should be aiming for a sort of minimum of 15 litres of milk per day of lifetime. So from when it's born until she exits the herd, they reckon that using German costs and German income, that you should be aiming for that. And anything that is not producing that sort of level is a cow that's losing you money. So actually looking at lifetime yield is how long it's been producing milk for, how much milk it's producing is quite a useful metric to use. So those are the two things I would say. Okay. If you can keep cows healthy and well, you keep them in the herd.
Yeah, Mike. Sorry, Andy. Mike, if I get the question correctly, I guess the person wants to know how many times the animal is expected to calve before you can say this is okay. Like you can now call the animal or remove the animal because the animal is no longer productive. So how many times should the animal calve before you can say okay?
Right.
I mean, I would say, look, as a general rule, you want to keep the animal healthy, well fed, in order to keep its production as high as you can for as long as possible. The longer the better. But as Mike says, after a period of time, the potential for yield will drop anyway.
All right.
So these things are, very variable and will be subject to kind of individual management, really, and individual systems. But by and large, it makes most sense to keep them as long as possible if they are producing well.
Okay.
Could I move on to the second one? Because I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, sure, because we have another person that wants to also ask questions.
Yeah.
So.
Duration of estrus, again, things are very variable. Nothing is very fixed in reproduction. The sort of rule of thumb is kind of between 12 and 24 hours, but it can be longer or shorter, usually shorter, and it can vary a lot in intensity as well. And so it may or may not be very obvious to see. In terms of timing of insemination, there is a variable window in which inseminations can be given, and how long the animal will be fertile for. But again, there are there's lots of individual variation. There's quite a lot of scientific literature on this, actually, which would be worth having a look at. But we had a rule, and again, I'm going to defer to Mike, but we had a rule of thumb in this country that if the cow is seen in the morning, then you inseminate in the afternoon, and if the cow is seen in the afternoon or evening, you inseminate the next morning. So it's roughly kind of half a day difference between the estrus and the insemination. I see we have some other questions, actually. Perhaps we should move on.
Yeah, sure. So Isaiah, you can ask a question.
Thank you, Prof, for the wonderful presentation. I just want to ask, I'm a veterinarian, and from literatures, I understand that cows can have 2 or 3 follicular waves before they eventually ovulate.
Yes.
Now, what determines whether a cow will have either 2 or 3 follicular waves.
Okay, you're going into the next level of endocrinological detail here, which I avoided for the purposes of this talk. You're absolutely right. You can get 2 or 3 or even more waves, I think, on various occasions. As far as and I'm a little bit rusty in my literature, I think 3 is the most common, but I'm not absolutely sure of that. And I don't know the answer to what determines it. But I remember being involved in a lot of discussions about this when I was a real academic, and talking about if a cow had 2 waves in one cycle, is that repeated in all her cycles, or if it's 3, is it always 3, or does it vary? Is it genetically determined? You know, what determines it? And I'm sorry, I'm a little out of date on all of that discussion, but again, I think the answer may be there, and I'll have another look at that actually. But it does become important when we're starting to talk about some of the methods of controlling the cycle by, you know, hormonal control with progesterone, GnRH, etc. But for present purposes, I felt it was unnecessary to go into that level of detail.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I'm not sure there is anybody raising hands, so probably I should just wrap it up by asking this question. I know you're familiar.
Hello, Andy, please, I'd like to ask a question.
Oh, somebody is asking question. All right, you may be the last person to ask question because of the time. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, please. My name is Ikenna. I'm actually in Cyprus. Yeah, I was. I'm currently in the dairy farm. Now, in relation to the tropical area in Africa, basically Nigeria, we know we have a lot of temperature variation, which has a problem in how affect reproduction, dealing with the kind of breeds of cattle we have in Nigeria. Especially with the zebu, or like the Frisian, which we have. I will basically want to ask now, in terms of estrous cycling and heat detection, how do we be able to manage the conditions in dealing with heat-related regions, heat and the estrous cycle? Does it have an implication? Heat and estrous cycle, please.
I would say
when you're talking about
yeah.
Then heat and temperature. I mean temperature, high extreme heat temperature and variation, and on the estrous cycle of an animal, and possibility the best possible time based on that to meet animal, possible detecting animal on heat in the morning, or possible you see an animal on heat, we do the best.
Yeah, I think the network is not that good. Yeah, but I don't know. Andy, did you get a question?
Well, I can answer the question.
Mating with the... Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll try to answer that very briefly, actually. Yes, of course, we know that the European breeds, cow particularly, are very susceptible to heat stress. And one of the things that suffers very badly because of that is because of reproduction. And so we know that there are severe effects of high environmental temperature on reproductive performance in European breeds. And whereas the local breeds are the tropical breeds are very much more resilient, and that's why we have them. Nevertheless, in some African countries, the Holstein, for example, because of its yield potential, has still remain very, very popular. But there are a lot of programs going on to try to, crossbreeding programs and other types of advanced genetics programs to try to improve both, or maintain both the resilience, but also the performance as well. And obviously that's a big challenge. Other than that, obviously there are management things you can do to try to mitigate the effects. I'm told that there is a new strain of cattle, a new strain of cow that has been developed in New Zealand that is more resilient to heat, can stand temperatures of a few degrees more than normal, that has been done, created genetically. But a lot of work was done on this by Bill Thatcher and his group in Gainesville, Florida, because obviously in the southern states of America, this has also been a big problem, and a lot of research has been done on that there. So yes, it is a problem, and that's why we need the local breeds, the local genetics to be maintained. But otherwise, we have to try to mitigate those effects. But happy to have a further discussion about that. Again, it's a bit outside the scope of today's talk. But thank you for the question. Thank you for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. So like I said, I may want to just ask this before we wrap up. I know you're familiar with estrus synchronization. I don't know. Is that, does it have any advantage when we talk about artificial insemination and detection of pregnancy and all? Does estrus synchronization has any advantage?
I'm smiling, sorry, because it's like everything else in life. Yes, it has advantages, but it has disadvantages as well. And it's not, it's something that it can help to solve problems, but it has to be managed very carefully. It doesn't kind of eliminate the need for good management and good observation. And of course, there is then an added expense too, which has to be factored in. But I would be very happy as part of this program to have further discussions about that and these various other questions, actually.
All right, probably we may consider it and factor into one of the training we are going to eventually bring up. Well, thank you so much, Andy, for this very wonderful presentation. And it has been, well, I think everybody has been wowed with the presentation and a lot of questions in mind. And well, we're still going to continue this training series next week and or the other week. And if we see that it will be necessary, we may have to add one more week to it to be able to come up with another training, as it will be necessary. So we thank everybody for coming around. As you may want to know, Mike Christian is the one hosting us. Well, I'm also hosting, so we are co-hosting. So thank you very much, Mike. Kara is out of this training because she has to go and do one or two things. She has also been very supportive. Thank you very much, Kara, in absentia. So we really appreciate this. And for everybody that has come to join us, we are so grateful. And I guess some people have already started dropping comments of how they've been able to enjoy the presentation. So we're very grateful for your comments. And like I said, by next week, 11 a.m. West African time, we're going to be converging again, and we're going to be considering artificial insemination. So we're going to be coming with another field expert in Nigeria that will be presenting on artificial insemination, and at least from the field experience, will be presenting on, and now it's local. So you can also come with some of the questions you may have on artificial insemination. And we can also be having some comments from outside the country on how artificial insemination should be better done. So I hope to see all of you next week. And for now, I want to say thank you to everybody and to our guest speaker, Andy Peters. Thank you so much. And let me say bye for now.